Okay, hello everyone. This is Professor Joseph Holbrook in sunny Columbia, Maryland. This is take 7, having some technical difficulties whenever the owners of applications like to change things around. Then I have the whole new learning curve, and I'm a grumpy old man. I'm sorry about that. I'm pleasant and smile for the rest of the time. We're talking about the process of independence in Latin America and taking our material from chapter 5 of John Chasteen's Born in Blood and Fire. I'll be teaching this course this fall. So let's just go ahead and jump right in. So here's the information on the book. And here we go. This is a picture of Simón Bolívar, el gran liberato. I can't even say it today. I can't speak Spanish today. I've been gone from Miami for 2 months, and already I can't speak Spanish. The Great Liberator. How about that? He was from Venezuela, and he liberated the northern part of South America from Venezuela, Colombia, Panama, actually, and Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. San Martin was from Argentina, and he did the same thing from the southern part of the continent. So let's jump back up here. So the Latin American struggles for independence erupted unexpectedly after a period of rumbling, which included the Haitian Revolution. And in 1780, there was a revolt among indigenous peoples in Peru. And so these rumblings were going on, before 1800, but with the rise of the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution, things began to get serious. One might expect that those at the bottom would revolt when European control slipped, but that did not happen in some places, notably Haiti. The outcome in the Spanish America and Brazil was conservative. I'm sorry, my previous comment, I read the sentence wrong. There was a revolt from the bottom in some places, including Haiti, where the slaves rose up in revolt against European control. But in most cases, that was not the case. In most parts of Spanish America and Brazil, it was not the poorest of the poor who rose up, the slaves or the indigenous. It was the Creole, the white Creoles. Creole in this context means a white European who is born in the Americas. In other words, they're not born in Spain or Portugal, but their parents were from Spain or Portugal. These were the people that led the fight for independence. So in this revolution, in most places, white people at the top of the social hierarchy stayed at the top, even though they kicked out the peninsulares, that is, those from Spain or Portugal. But it was still white people at the top who were in control of the hierarchy, while blacks and indigenous people stayed at the bottom. In other words, this is not exactly a social revolution. It was a political revolution. Some cases maybe slightly economic, but not social. The Latin American independence created a dozen of the world's first constitutional republics. The fighting brought a new status to mestizos. And you saw the picture I showed a moment ago, the Haitian Revolution in 1791. It's a fascinating story. I highly encourage you to read up on it. The first successful slave revolt in all of history was in Haiti. And it was also the first successful war of independence in Latin America. That is, excluding the rebellion of the 13 British colonies in North America. Haiti also was instrumental in giving financial support, guns, and men to Simón Bolívar to continue the fight when he was down and out. Winning the wars of independence required more than blood. It also required a sense of belonging and shared purpose. The modern nations of Latin America did not yet exist. What did a slave, an African slave, a Quechua-speaking villager, or an Aztec who spoke Nahuatl, a landowner of pure Spanish blood or a mestizo artisan have in common, just because they had all been born in Peru or Mexico. So you can see there was a challenge in creating a sense of national identity when you had such diverse populations. Not much aside from they didn't have much in common except for being subjects of the Spanish crown. You take the Spanish crown away and they really had nothing in common. Patriot leaders faced a great challenge. They had to imagine a new nations and get other people with little in common to imagine the same nation. To understand the people's actions during this period from about 1808 through 1825, we must be aware that events in Europe suddenly destabilized colonial rule. Then we will see how events in Europe, how Latin Americans reacted, a story with several different threads. Core areas like Mexico and Peru followed one pattern. Fringe areas like Venezuela and Argentina followed another pattern. Brazil followed its own quite distinctive path to independence. The wars of independence cast a long shadow over Latin America. So what happened in Europe? In 1788, the calamitous rule of the incompetent Carlos IV came to an end. He shirked his royal responsibilities. He left governing to a hated minister, widely known to be the Queen's lover. Misrule had combined with a series of costly wars to bankrupt the Spanish state during the 1700s. So the bankruptcy of the crown led to higher taxes as well as to other irritating practices like the sale of higher offices, which put incompetent people in positions of command and highly unpopular government. With England broke out in 1796. This was in the wake of the French Revolution when Spain was in an alliance with France. So higher taxes, sale of higher offices, incompetent people in power, government foreclosure of long-term loans, war with England in 1796. The Spanish Navy was wiped out and a crippled Atlantic trade. And Portugal, on the other hand, remained a steadfast ally with England. Portugal had maintained friendly relationships with England since the 1300s. A relationship described in the 1386 Treaty of Windsor as inviolable, eternal, solid, perpetual, and true. A league of friendship. A relationship that England dominated, of course, as a more powerful nation. England would also prove a valuable but demanding ally. But English ally or no, the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars started a process in independence in Brazil as well as in the Spanish territories. The French revolutionaries of the 1790s had challenged the idea of a monarchy based on divine right, even executing the French king and queen, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. These revolutionaries took inspiration from the intellectual awakening called the Enlightenment. They proclaimed liberty, equality, and fraternity. They questioned traditional authority, and they remade the political order. They sneered at idiot kings who, thanks to their royal bloodlines, possessed power they did not deserve. Instead, the revolutionaries argued for the idea of popular sovereignty. So the French Revolution challenged monarchy based on divine right. It executed the king and queen, argued for popular sovereignty. Napoleon set out to liberate Europe from the monarchs. He attacked Portugal for its alliance with Great Britain, but to get to Portugal, he had to pass through Spain in 1808. And even though Spain was his ally, as he was passing through Spain with Spain's permission, he decided to remove Carlos IV, the incompetent Carlos IV, and place his brother, that is Napoleon Bonaparte's brother Joseph, on the throne, King Pepe. And of course, the Spanish were not happy about this. England's own civil war and revolution in the 1600s had enshrined the principle of popular sovereignty in the unwritten English constitution. England preserved a limited monarchy subordinate to the House of Commons, which liberals regarded as the voice of the people. In sum, liberalism in France or England, both one or the other kind of liberalism, inspired all sides in the Napoleonic Wars. It was the impact of those wars what triggered the Latin American independence. all under the ideological banner of popular sovereignty. One aspect of colonial hegemony had been the gradual acceptance of the Spanish and Portuguese monarchs as rightful rulers by almost everyone in Spanish and America and Brazil. The crown had a strong legitimacy. Authority, remember, legitimacy is authority that inspires obedience. It's essential for hegemony. In 1810, there was a startling contrast. The Portuguese crown was closer than ever to Brazil. The Spanish crown, usurped by a foreigner, was further than ever away from Spanish America. Brazilian history shows how much difference the king's presence could make in the colonies. And here's a picture. Here's a couple pictures. Let me go ahead and pull those up. And we saw the picture of the Haitian Revolution, hanging a French officer there. Here's the battle between the British and the French and the Brazilian court of 20,000 people, the royal throne, moving with all their banking and finances, loading onto British ships and Portuguese ships to move their capital from Lisbon to Rio de Janeiro eventually. And here's the Portuguese court in Brazil. So it's the first and only monarchy that transferred its royal throne to the American hemisphere. So the Portuguese court was in Rio de Janeiro and become the political center of the Portuguese-speaking world, and the people of Rio were always fond of glamour, were delighted to have it there. It maintained the legitimacy of the Brazilian government for a little longer, or the Portuguese government. Crown authority had inspired obedience. The royal court now operated within Brazil, and wealthy Europeans flooded into Rio de Janeiro. The presence of the court also favored the Brazilian elite, for the opportunity to speak a few words directly into the king's ear was invaluable. At the end of the colonial trade monopolies also favored Brazil as a whole. Before, Brazilian trade had all been channeled through Portugal, but now João allowed Brazilians to trade directly with everyone, including the British, who had pressed strongly for this trade opening, and imported goods became less expensive. João liked Rio and enjoyed placid naps in his botanical garden as ships from Europe and Spanish America brought news of one distant upheaval after another. So this brings us to the Spanish crisis. Imprisonment of the Spanish king created a crisis of legitimacy. The Spanish government had not vanished entirely because of provincial resistance movements in Spain sent representatives to a national resistance committee called the Junta Central. The Junta Central expected Spanish American support, but the Spanish American had other ideas. The Junta Central had been chosen entirely in Spain. It therefore represented the Spanish people, but not the Spanish American people. Therefore, the Americanos rejected its dictates. That is representation, taxation without representation. Spanish Americans rejected the rule of the junta. They professed loyalty to Fernando VII, who was the son of Carlos IV, as the legitimate ruler, but they rejected the ideas that the Americas were colonies. They wanted something somewhat similar to Brazil, where there could be a kingdom of Colombia, kingdom of Argentina, kingdom of New Spain that were equal to Spain. The Spanish and Americas were co-equal kingdoms of Spain in their minds. They were loyal to Fernando but not subservient to Spain. They began forming local juntas to rule in Fernando's name in places such as Buenos Aires and Caracas and Cartagena. Notice they're especially our trading cities. They formed town councils called Cabildo Abierto. Okay, here's a picture, famous picture by Goya of the war, the Spanish uprising against the French. and there was a night of a bloody night of uprising, and then the Spanish resorted to guerrilla warfare against the French. That's Goya. So this brings us to Mexico, and Padre Miguel. Sorry, I lost my spot here. Manuel Hidalgo was Father Manuel Hidalgo was a Spanish priest. He called for a revolution against Spain. Poor rural people joined his rebellion. Men, women, children, livestock, weapons were used as farming tools. I'm sorry, I should have said that the other way around. Farming tools were utilized as weapons. They attacked and killed Peninsulares and Creoles without much distinction between them. Hidalgo's army reached as many as 80,000 at one point, but they were undisciplined and out of control. The army dispersed them after only a few months. Hidalgo himself was captured and executed. This was in Mexico. In point of fact, it was the Creoles, not the Peninsulars of 1810, who descended from the original conquerors. So the white Mexicans or the white Peruvians were the ones who descended directly from the original conquistadores. In truth, Hidalgo had more in common with most Peninsulares, his social peers, than with his own indigenous parishioners. But his rhetoric constructed a simple dichotomy, Americans versus the Europeans. His battle cry was, "Long live the Virgin of Guadalupe and death to the Spaniards." After he was captured and killed, another priest, this is back before the Catholic Church was quite so rigidly conservative in Latin America. Another priest named Jose Maria Morelos arose to take his place. Let me see if I can pull that one up. Here's a picture of Padre Morelos. He was a mestizo officer in Hidalgo's army. He was a better organizer than Hidalgo, and he led a disciplined army. He had clear goals, which was to end slavery, into the caste system, into the tribute paid by indigenous people. All born in the Americas were Americanos. He declared Mexican independence in 1813. He was also eventually captured and executed. So this brings us to Peru. Creoles were wary of the indigenous people due to the history of Tupac Amaru II in the 1780s, when he led a rebellion that rocked the Andes and went on for 2 years and resulted in almost 200,000 deaths. This rebellion of Tupac Amaru had given the Peruvian Creoles a vivid awareness of the dangers inherent of mobilizing indigenous people against the Peninsulares. The Creoles of Lima formed no junta and took care not to make no Hidalgo-style appeal to the indigenous population. If the native Andeans learned one way or the other, it was leaned one way or the other, it was toward loyalty to Fernando VII. Mostly, however, indigenous peoples preferred to be left alone and left out of the fight. Creole patriot attempts to engage indigenous fighters made slow and very uneven progress. Patriots, only somewhat less than royalists, treated the indigenous with casual brutality. This also happened in Venezuela with the dark-skinned vaqueros, who were mestizos or mulattoes. They tended to fight, in the beginning, they tended to fight more for the king than for the Creoles and the patriots who rose up against the king. The core areas of the empire, such as Peru, stayed safely in Spain's hands. The Creole elite were afraid of the indigenous or slave rebellions. The fringe areas, such as Venezuela or Argentina, were the first to rebel through the formation of the open town councils, or cabildos abiertos. This was a rebellion from above. In essence, it's not that it's not that different from the American War of Independence of the northern 13 English colonies, which was also a rebellion from above. It was not a popular uprising. The dark-skinned vaquero cowboys in Venezuela fought on horseback in favor of the king and against the patriots, and that was one of Simon Bolivar's earliest defeats, was handed to him by them. In Argentina, the revolutionary junta had an easier time. The patriot advantage began back in 1806 when the Spanish and British were enemies. The two British expeditions landed and tried to invade Rio de la Plata, and both were defeated by local Argentine militias. This gave them a morale boost and a patriotic identity. By May 1810, the peninsular control had ended once and for all in Buenos Aires. In other regions of the Rio de la Plata, viceroyalty showed little inclination to follow the lead of Buenos Aires. And finally, Spain got around to sending a reserve force to try to take back the areas that had been won over by the revolutionaries. This is a picture of General Pablo Morillo, a Spanish general noted for his brutality. In 1815, with the execution of Morelos in Mexico, royalist victories in Venezuela and elsewhere, such as Colombia and Chile, Peru still firmly in Spanish hands, the patriots fighting among themselves in Rio de la Plata, it seemed that the struggle for Spanish independence stood at a low ebb. The patriots had not yet succeeded in getting enough people on their side, and it was at that point when Fernando VII was restored to the throne of Spain and began to reassert absolutist control, and he sent a fleet with General Pablo Morillo to reconquer Latin America for Spain. The picture of Simón Bolívar and Girardot. So, this leads us to nativism. Nativism is an ideology or a concept that glorifies the natives. Creole elites had no interest in liberating indigenous, mestizo, or people of African descent, nor did they desire a more egalitarian society. They simply wanted to kick out the peninsulares at the top and take their place. Mexican and Peruvian elites were especially terrified by the possibility of popular rebellions. The uprising of Tupac Amaru in 1780, of Toussaint Louverture in Haiti in 1791, and Miguel Hidalgo in 1810 in Mexico terrified them. They did not want that. So nativism became a winning strategy adopted by the Creoles. Nativism glorifies an American identity defined by the birthplace. Los Americanos. We're todos somos Americanos. This is what the Creole shared in common with indigenous people and the people of mixed blood or African descent. Americanos became a key nativist word. The enemies of the Americanos were everyone born in Spain or Portugal. The name Americanos fit easily and comfortably over the many-hued Spanish-American populations, contrasting them with Europeans. 1808 began a process of independence in Brazil as well. British and French, as well as Portuguese, flocked to Brazil's ports to do trade. They brought free trade, liberalizing changes of attitude, political ferment. In 1815, João declared Brazil to be a kingdom equal to Portugal. In 1817, there was an attempt at rebellion in Pernambuco. King João's forces easily put down that rebellion. 1821, under pressure, João returns to Portugal and leaves the Prince Pedro I in charge of Brazil. In 1822, the prince, which is now Dom Pedro I, announced that he was staying in Brazil in a famous saying called Eu Fico, I'm staying, yo me quedo, and declared that Brazil would be independent from Portugal. And this is kind of a soft revolution from above, if you want to call it that. So Brazil's path did not involve much blood or fighting. This is Dom Pedro I announcing he was staying in Brazil and separating Brazil from Portugal. And here's his coronation as the first emperor of Brazil, Pedro I. So, from 1815 to 1825, there began to be patriot victories. Spanish-American nativists regained momentum. Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. Fernando VII had recovered his throne. He renounced the liberal constitution of Cadiz and set out to crush the patriot rebels in America by sending Pablo Morillo. Spanish reluctance to recognize Spanish American independence, or equality at least, left the rebels nowhere to go but forward. In South America, Spanish royalist forces held Peruvian Andes until they were ultimately defeated. In a great continental pincer movement, which I've already alluded to, armies came northward from Argentina and southward from Venezuela and Colombia, and eventually liberated Peru. In Mexico, the Creoles entered into an alliance with the heirs of Morelos movement and backed reluctantly into independence. And there's a picture of Creole General Agustin Iturbide. Seems like I can't move that. Agustin Iturbide switched sides and joined forces with the Mexican guerrilla fighters under Vicente Guerrero. Bolivar had earlier been defeated by the Mestizo Llaneros, but he was forced to flee from Venezuela. He ended up staying for some time in Jamaica and later in Haiti. Haiti offered him refuge and military support in exchange for his promise that he would declare an end to slavery. So he returned to Venezuela with a different attitude towards the Llaneros, and he, with certain feats of strength and heroism, he won the Llaneros over to his side. In the south, Argentine General Jose de San Martin organized an army combined of Argentines and Chileans, crossed over the Andes Mountains, and approached Lima from the south, while the Venezuelan and Colombians approached from the north. So the last battle was fought in 1824 in Ayacucho, which is now present-day Bolivia. Here's a map of the wars. You see this up here. You see the revolutionary armies moving northward from Argentina, Chile, up into Peru, and then southward from Venezuela, Colombia, in a pincers movement. There was Brazilian independence was pretty much on its own, and in Mexico they had their own independence process, and that pretty much tells the story of South American independence. This is a picture of a chinganas. The music and dance of the common people enjoyed a patriotic vogue in the wake of national independence struggles. In the 1820s, in Chile, soldiers and people of various social classes mingled at open-air venues called chinganas to dance the cueca, a national Chilean dance. This actually happened in a number of parts of Latin America. In Brazil, it was samba. In Venezuela, it was the tango. In Cuba, it eventually was the salsa. In the Dominican Republic, it was, lately bachata, but before that, it was merengue. These are all types of popular music that emerged from the bottom up, from the popular classes. You could say it's an example of transculturation, and the elites would utilize it and kind of co-opt it to try to bring a sense of national unity, using folk type music as a unifying force in their country. So the broad contours of colonial Latin American culture and society underwent no profound or sudden change. For all the talk of America for the Americans, the old hierarchy of status and race created by colonization with Native Americans and Africans at the bottom did not change. There's a bunch of fictional novels in Latin America about this. Creole descendants of the conquerors continued to profit from the ill-paid labor of the conquered and the enslaved. Independence did not undo colonialism in Latin American nations. Rather, it made them post-colonial, which we'll be talking about soon. There were some heroic women in this fight for independence. In Colombia, Manuela Beltrán initiated the Comunero Revolt. In 1816, Policarpa Salvarrieto was hanged in Bogota for carrying messages for the patriots. In Peru, you had Micaela Bastides y Bartolina Sisa executed with their husbands. In Bolivia, you had Juana Azurduy wearing a man's uniform and leading a cavalry charge. So it's important to understand that women were a vital part of this process of independence. Bolivar himself came to believe that a democracy would not work in the lands he had liberated, and his mood turned increasingly authoritarian. Before his death, he complained that he had plowed the sea and accomplished nothing. Immediate change was not the measure of independence. Nation building, the consolidation of civic habits, and governing institutions is hard work. That work was made more challenging by the divided character and historical antagonism of the Latin American populations. The blood and fire of the colonial inheritance led to an almost impossible task of creating a sense of national identity. Somehow the exploiters and the exploited were supposed to shake hands, make up, and start anew. Bolivar was adamant that Venezuelans of all colors be regarded as equal citizens of the nation, so he did his best to keep his promise to Haiti. Unfortunately, though, truly inclusive nations would not emerge in Latin America until the 20th century. In the meantime, the old rallying cry, Americanos, lost relevance as Spanish America shattered into a dozen national pieces. The Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata alone broke into 4 independent countries: Bolivia, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Argentina. The same thing happened in La Gran Colombia, which broke into Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and, say, Peru. Actually, Peru was not part of La Gran Colombia, but okay, so that's all we got for today. Thank you so much for your kind attention. We will be back next week with another exciting installment of Latin American history. Thank you very much.